Hey everybody, and welcome to session 5 of Category Palooza 2023. The title of today's session is When Service Demand Exceeds Capabilities. And we're actually going to take a little bit of a deep dive into the utilities and energy categories, but also use that as a bit of a proxy for what organizations can do when you really feel like you've got too much demand on your team. What can you do about that? How can you best support your stakeholders? What are some of the risks of just kind of letting things drop because you don't have the capabilities to do anything about it? Now, before we start, I want to thank you for sticking with us in that last session as we had the tech gremlins. I think that's always one of the things, unfortunately, of live, but we're going to do what we can to pull that session together into a recording to make it a lot easier to digest as well after the event. Having said that, I want to introduce my guest for this session, which is Andrew Henson. Andrew is Fine-Tune's Vice President of Energy, Utilities, and Sustainability. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Phil.
Now, as we go through this session, if you have any comments, questions, anything like that, please feel free to pop those in the chat. Mike, yeah, as you say, that's what the tech goblin slayers are for. So hopefully did their job and we put those tech issues to bed. Now, let's go into the first question. I just wonder if you could talk, because we talked about using energy and utilities and talking a lot about that category in the context of the bigger picture for procurement. What's the state of the energy and utilities category right now?
If I could boil it down to, maybe a word or a couple of words, I'd say rapidly changing. It's probably the first time I've been in the energy industry my entire career. The first probably 10 or 15 years of it, there was a lot of, what do you do? What exactly is energy? And, what is electricity? I didn't know you could buy electricity and natural gas. But, in the past 4 to 5 years, as there's been, a big sustainability revolution, as there's been a lot of volatility in markets, weather events, all those things together, it started to pick up a little bit more mainstream coverage. And with that, more eyes on it. And then with, changing political landscapes, there's a lot of, volatility. So I'd say it's changing both, in the day-to-day operations, what you can do, when you can do it, but also, the outlook, tools, technology that are coming online that enable you to do things that you couldn't do 15, 20 years ago, are really, changing the category fundamentally. So there's a lot going on, and not all of it's great. Some of it's not great, but rapidly changing. I think if I could just boil it down to that.
Now, I want to dig into some of those as we go through the conversation, but I kind of want to level set as well. When we talk about energy and utilities, are there specific subcategories that typically make up that area of spend?
Oh, absolutely. I would say, from the top, if you look at the total category, the effective management of electricity and natural gas in particular, but you could throw water in there as well. There are, probably 5 or 6 subcategories. Demand management, how much you're in efficiency, how much you're using. There's obviously the procurement element, how much you're paying for it. There's the management of the data itself, right? There's a whole process, accounts payable processes that encompass just utility invoices. They're one of the very few subsets of invoices that can't just not be paid. All invoices need to be paid, obviously, but if you don't pay your utility bills, then you get your power or your gas shut off, and nobody wants that. So there's an accounts payable function and element. There's sustainability initiatives. There's tariff optimization, regulatory proceedings and support, how you can impact, the spend that you can't necessarily shop, but that you could influence from a regulatory perspective. So there's a lot of different areas of expertise and hundreds of thousands of employees around the country, the world, that are focused on all of those different nuances within the category.
Now, a lot of times when you do you're looking at all your spend across the entire organization, and you're doing your categorization, your subcategorization. Now, oftentimes people will get to, and I say this from my personal experience of doing it earlier in my career, is you get to utilities and you just think, that's not really addressable because it's nothing I can control. What do you say to people who go through that process and look at utilities and say that's not addressable?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've heard my entire career also is there's nothing we can do about it. I've got, this utility right here, and they provide electricity or they provide natural gas, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it couldn't be further from the truth. There are lots of things that you can do around it. Tariff optimization is one thing. Utilities, regulated utilities in particular, where the thought is that you can't shop for the commodity, have lots of programs and lots of incentives that are available to buyers that incentivize certain consumption profiles, right? So in a perfect world, if you think about it, not to get too energy nerdy, but if you think about the consumption of energy, you do it like this, right? You purchase it a whole lot during business operations, not as much overnight. But utilities want to send incentives for you to purchase energy like this, right? And so to the degree that you can shift operations or take advantage because your operations manage that kind of profile more than maybe the standard, there are incentives and tariffs and options available for those types of end users. So I say, it's absolutely not the case. If you just kind of peel back the onion a little bit and think about it less from the sense that can I launch an RFP, and more around, well, what can I do with what I have?
Yeah. Now, I may be going into the weeds on this, but how can you determine, or how can you see, where do you get the information that says, like, this is my energy usage pattern, that I am a pretty consistent user of energy, for example, versus just using it at the traditional peaks of the day?
Yeah, it's, leading with data is certainly not a new, it's not a new concept, right? But in energy and utilities, it's particularly critical. You can't measure, you can't act on what you can't see. And there are lots of different solutions and technologies out there. Obviously, the invoice itself, right, can tell you how much you're using in a given month. But even, the advancements in technology and the readiness of what are called real-time meters give you access to that information at any point in time. Utilities will offer them, backdated a little bit, 2, 3, 4 days behind, a month behind. You can put your own technology on premise to allow you to see that information real time as well through some sort of building management system or a sub-meter that you might own yourself.
Now, I want to take it back up a level before we go too much into the tactics. I know I was kind of leading you down that way with that question, but I'm thinking if anybody's has gone through the process of identifying, okay, utilities energy spend is this big chunk of money, and it usually is a pretty big chunk of money, and they're not managing it today, how should they start? Like, what do they do first, or how do you start thinking about, okay, I'm going to bring this into scope? Are there specific stakeholders that we need to be thinking about within the business, or what's kind of your recommendation of how to actually make this a category that procurement can play a role in and can have more impact in?
Yeah, I'd say, well, there's a couple things. I think the first most critical thing is to make sure that what we talked about earlier at the beginning of the call, all the different facets, each of the different kind of subcategories within have their own effective owners or their category manager or experts in that specific area, right? If you're looking to address this for the first time, or maybe you're just thinking about it a little bit differently, you have to bring all those people together, right? You have to centralize both procurement, or all procurement, operations, accounts payable, right? You have to bring all those people together, because that's where the struggles come in, is that this idea that I've got this need for this information over here, I've got this need for this information over here. And so we're going to build up silos, because that's the only way I know how to get it done today. So if you are struggling, 9 times out of 10, that's why, is because it's too hard to get a hold of accounts payable or a local site engineer that might have the information that I need. So I've got to do something different. So I'd say centralization is the place to start, and then go from there to determine what are your goals as a company.
Yeah. So from a centralization, as I scribble some notes here, is this a category where there's no real owner, which is both a challenge and opportunity for procurement? So there's lots of stakeholders across the business who are impacted by the cost of energy, but there's not necessarily somebody who is overseeing what do we do about this strategically.
No, most companies, especially larger companies where you're spending, 7, 8, 9 figures in some cases on utilities a year. Yeah, they'll have dedicated category managers and even teams in some cases, but rarely are they all encompassing, right? Rarely does any one energy manager at an organization have autonomy or have support from all of the other categories, right? So they don't necessarily control all the different spaces, even though they're the quote unquote energy expert of the organization. They don't have any control over the bills. They don't have any controls over the payables, but they're the energy expert. And that disconnect is what causes a lot of issues.
Interesting. So they're buying, where you have an organization that's big enough that they have somebody who's leading energy or utilities, but they're still buying it in isolation of usage, essentially, and the strategies and the tactics you can use from a usage perspective, they're just looking at a rate and saying, okay, how do I manage that rate?
In a lot of cases, yes. And
Mm-hmm.
when you go to those specific experts and you say, well, what about this or what about this? It's, oh, well, that guy handles that, or that guy handles it, or I can't touch that. I can only deal with the actual running of the RFP, for example.
Yeah. How do regulations actually impact the management of energy and utility spend?
Quite significantly. And again, not to get too into the weeds, but from a regulatory perspective, it's still a fairly new category. Late 80s, early
Mm-hmm.
90s, when the idea that you could purchase and source electricity and natural gas from a third party really became mainstream. And even today, roughly, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40% of the country or facilities are in markets where you can source electricity. There's more for natural gas, but electricity in particular. So regulations have a very big impact, both in the ability to source natural gas and electricity,
Mm-hmm.
but increasingly the quality. Right, when you talk about new emissions regulations that state, you have to reduce your CO2 baseline, so that means you can't buy from the traditional sources that you used to buy in the
Mm-hmm.
past. Now you have to evaluate alternative, greener technologies and generation resources.
So
So
how much?
regulation is a big play.
Yeah, yeah. How much? And this may be a naive question from a non-expert in this category, but how many options or choices do you have in the market for where you buy your energy generation from? I always think of it as being pretty siloed, and you've got one utility. You have to deal with that utility, and you might not get a lot of choice. Is there actually a lot more of a kind of a broader market at play where you can tap in to alternative different sources of supply?
Yeah, in deregulated markets in particular. So if you're looking at a map of the U.S., most of the Northeast, Illinois, Texas, and a chunk of the West Coast,
Mm-hmm.
you have the ability to source electricity from a third party, right? So that means that you can run an RFP and you can send it to 10, in some cases 20, however many companies you want to. There are a lot of different electricity and natural gas marketers in the U.S. Natural gas, like I said, it's a little bit more open, depending on the
Mm-hmm.
size of the commercial account, for example. So you can run RFPs, 5, 10, 15, 20 companies can be included in that in certain markets. But to your point, there are a majority of the United States, a majority of facilities in the United States exist in those markets where you can't run an RFP. You
Yeah.
can't source competitively.
And in those markets where there's not really a competitive option, it's more around usage. Or is that kind of a tactic that you look at from a
It's more
cost
around
management
use.
perspective?
It's around usage everywhere, right? I mean,
Yep.
using less means you're spending less, right? So it's around usage
Yeah.
everywhere. But in those markets, it's optimizing the incentives and where you can't source electricity or natural gas from a third party. It's
Mm-hmm.
optimizing those tariffs that those utilities have available. So you can't run an RFP, but you can take advantage of their programs and their incentives that would enable you to spend less, depending on what your usage profile is.
What does the supplier relationship typically look like with a utility company and an organization? Does that very, very much differ based on how much money you're spending? Is it kind of a one-way relationship, or do you find that you have the ability to use supplier relationship management to create stronger relationships with your utility that then perhaps open up not necessarily access to some of those programs, but the utilities become more proactive in sharing them with you?
So it differs, right? Different utilities of
Mhm.
different size have different infrastructure and different abilities to engage with their customers on a regular basis. You think about, the city of X that is in rural Kansas that might have 4 or 5 employees. They're not going
Yeah.
to be able to have a team of account managers that Pacific Gas and Electric in the Bay
Yeah.
Area have, right? So it differs, but I will say, to the degree that you are a large or top 2-3% in terms of
Mhm.
capacity for a specific utility, you can have good relationships with those with the account managers, with the utilities themselves. But because they're regulated, that doesn't necessarily mean good
Yeah.
supplier relationships equal this. It can mean that
Yeah.
you could be put they can approach regulators with ideas that you might have or might want to do. But at the end of the day, it's very regulated. So they can't
Mhm.
necessarily offer you special incentives for being their biggest customer. They have to offer those incentives to all customers.
Yeah.
Certain utilities find ways of getting around that, saying, "Oh, this tariff is only available to automobile manufacturers that employ more than 200,000 employees
Yeah.
around the United States." So they
Just
can kind of
based
get
on this
around
road.
it. Exactly. So I'd say holistically, it is very much one way, right? Because
Mhm.
what are you going to do at the end of the day if you're not happy with your electric service? Are you going to move your entire operation? Probably not.
I want to kind of I want to encourage anybody who has any questions around this discussion. Please feel free, pop them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye open for that to see if there's anything that you'd like to pose to Andrew. But as we do that, how you talked earlier about tools and technology is evolving, that's changing the ways that we're able to manage energy and utilities. I think that's the case across procurement as well. I just wonder if you could share a couple of examples of where that is specifically in the two energies and utilities.
Yeah. Depending on which, just going back again to the subcategories, which
Yeah.
of the subcategories we're looking at, there are different technologies and different tools available. When you think about the management of the optimization of how much you're using, right? Demand and efficiency projects, there
Mhm.
are all sorts of tools available, right? You've got real-time access to monitoring lighting controls at a facility that we can tell if somebody's walking down a hallway, and if they're walking down that hallway, we want that light on. But if there's nobody in the area, we want that light to turn off, right?
Yeah.
So to save money, obviously, right? And then from from an accounts payable perspective, there are consolidating platforms, tools, and technologies that will bring utility bills and aggregate them to support payables, right? Instead of a
Mhm.
thousand bills coming into you that you need to scan and that you need to stamp and that you need to pay, right? There are bill aggregators, and that's not necessarily unique to utilities, but I'd
Yeah.
say it's probably one of the more mature categories for this type of service and technology. That's important. There are a lot of different tools and technologies that do bill simulation, right? If you get a bill for, in some cases, $1 million, how do you know that
Mhm.
that's right? Right? You
Yeah.
know that it's right because somebody sent it to you, but do you have insights into the market data that would also back that up? Right? There are tools and technologies that support that as well. So it really depends. What area you're looking at, that you're trying to manage, or that you have access to that data that you can, you know, couple that with the right tools that help glean the most insights out of it.
So, thinking about the maturity of a buying organization, on their journey to more effectively manage utilities and energy, are there certain things that you would recommend you start at the beginning of the journey, versus tools, techniques, tactics that are more, okay, we've kind of got a baseline and we're comfortable with where we have a baseline. Now we want to take things to the next level.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd say it's kind of counterintuitive to kind of slow down, right? We're in a society of move fast and break things, right?
Yeah.
With that kind of approach, though, that's when you get that this is the tool we have that does this. This is the tool that we have that does this. This is the tool that we
Yeah.
have that does this. Starting and really putting together a comprehensive view, right, of what our goals are from an energy and utilities
Hmm.
perspective, whether it be net zero transition, whether it be paying the lowest price possible, whether it be budget certainty, right? You have to establish what your goals are at very high levels, right? Because that's where decisions get made, and then provide those in the category, those in the trenches on a day-to-day basis with the tools and the technology to go and execute that vision and achieve those goals and those results.
Mm. Um, we've touched on this a little bit about emissions, but how much are you finding that sustainability is playing into strategy decisions that are being made around energy usage?
Oh, it's huge. And not necessarily from the idea that companies are using sustainability to do efficient. Oh, they are, right, obviously.
Mhm.
But I think that right now that's a really big disconnect in the industry right now, is that we have these big sustainability goals over here, but we don't necessarily know to invest in these types of projects, or that to do these kind of things to help us reduce our energy consumption and thus reduce our emissions, right? There's not always that connection. Sustainability and any other group, they're not always connected in their goals, or at least they're not connected in how they're going to achieve those goals. Yeah, I hear all the time procurement, energy procurement professionals say, I'm supposed to reduce my emissions. I've been told I need to reduce my emissions. I don't know what to do, though. I mean, I don't have a budget to do it. I don't have the data to do it. I don't have somebody at site that's going to support me to do it. I've just been told by sustainability that I need to reduce my emissions.
Now, when you hear them say that, it's kind of going back to the where do they start? But because there's an array of somebody who's been told that they're not really sure what to do, probably has a lot of things that they've heard they could possibly do, not quite sure how to sequence it. What would you recommend for anybody who is under pressure to consider sustainability and emissions in terms of energy purchase, but don't really know where to start?
Yeah, it's, I kind of go back to a lot of organizations have been put under this pressure to enact sustainable practices, right? You look at BlackRock, you look at pending SEC regulations. There's a lot of outside forces that say you need to do this. You need to be a more sustainable organization, or at the very least, you need to start reporting on your sustainability initiatives. And when companies are struggling with that, it's always because that question or that imperative comes from the top down, and they say, go figure it out, go do it, right? But they don't always have. So if you're struggling with it, right, you have to build the case around how this helps everything that you're trying to do, how this helps reduce spend, how this helps reduce emissions. Yeah, there might be a 16-month payback, and that's 2 months longer than we normally do for capital projects. But so what, right? It has all of these rippling effects across our organization. So we reach our sustainability goals faster. We pay less, right? There's a lot more. So that's what you have to consider in your message. And when you're struggling, a lot of the times that struggle comes from, it's a net cost, right? Procurement professionals are always put in positions, not always, but a lot of the times they're put in positions to reduce spend, right? And when they come and when energy professionals come and say, hey, well, we're going to spend a little bit, right? That's where you kind of get a sideways look. What do you mean? And empowering procurement professionals to make that decision, or to present that decision, or present that option that you can then act on, is where a lot of companies need to be kind of focusing, and where professionals need to be putting themselves in a position of doing.
I think that, talking about building business cases and putting options forward is obviously a really important role that procurement can play. And I want to just touch before we wrap up on change management in the space. How can if a procurement leader has, again, looked at this as a category that they want to start focusing on that they haven't necessarily focused on before, you brought together a collection of stakeholders from around the business who are interested and have some reason to be vested in the energy strategy, utility strategy. What are some of the things that procurement can do, or that you see procurement folks do, that are successful in building influence around energy and utilities? Kind of what are they doing to move things forward, to get that influence, to start really being able to have an impact in the category?
Yeah, I think most of the success from within procurement comes when, and I hate to say that this is a special category that requires any sort of special treatment, but the very nature of, just the invoices themselves, right, require their own special processes. So procurement being in a position to carve out a specific process or a specific way of sourcing and managing energy and utilities that is uniquely distinct from the way that we purchase and source and contract and manage vendor relationship, that's unique from not everything else, because I'm sure that there are other categories that require this level of oversight and nuance as well. But procurement being in a position to say, look, the status quo, just running an RFP for the sake of running an RFP because we're told to run an RFP isn't going to get it done. Just because we want to pay net 30 on our electricity bills doesn't mean we can actually do it, right? Because we're going to have late fees, we're going to get shut off, right? So I think when procurement puts the category in a position to say, hey, it requires its own insights, it requires its own tools, technology, processes, that's when they can influence the most change in the organization.
Yeah, I think that is really important. as a function, we have pushed ourselves to standardization of process. And I think we're going backwards from that now and realizing, well, that's not necessarily working. And, first of all, well, that doesn't work for the marketing category, or that doesn't work for the travel category, or that doesn't work for the other. There's a realization that we're trying to push square pegs into round holes sometimes in terms of process. And that's actually disenfranchising us with all the different stakeholders, because they look at thinking, well, procurement doesn't really understand what it is that we're talking about. So I think that's really important. As you think about a utilities and an energy specific procurement process, what are just some of the things that we should be taking into consideration as we look to build that out, so it doesn't look too different from, we can kind of sell it as the procurement process, but the reality is it is pretty unique to what you're buying.
Yeah, I think particularly when it comes to the measurement and the performance of how procurement are doing in the category, right? It's a commodity, right? So it does this all the time, right? So
Yeah.
the measurement of savings and the imperative on savings can sometimes get in the way of what otherwise would successfully support the management of the category, right? So
Yeah.
what I mean by that really is, historically, the best strategy for securing the lowest price of electricity and natural gas has been to not hedge, right? To ride the
Yeah.
index, to go with the ebbs and the
Yeah.
flows, because over time you can see that prices on that strategy are going to be lower than if you had paid the premium to fix the price, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what you have is a lot of procurement professionals that say, well, I can't really count because it's a market change. I can't really count that as savings. And then in some organizations we say, hey, market went down, I get to claim that, right? And so the imperative on savings is a really difficult thing for energy procurement professionals in particular to be kind of judged on. So when you're talking about that process in particular, I think that that has to not go away, right? Obviously, we have to measure the savings and keeping a low baseline, but to really effectively manage the category, you need to look at a lot of other things. The net, the expansive benefits to a specific strategy that is not just the lowest cost. It's reliable. It's green. It's from a supplier that we value more so than another supplier that was just offering a lower price product. Maybe they're extending payment terms. Maybe they're doing this. Maybe they're doing that. Right. So there's a lot more to it than just the lowest price of a commodity that kind of fluctuates on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that's probably a shift as well, because you think of energy as being a commodity, but the reality is, you're buying as much as with lots of other categories. It's all about total cost of ownership and much bigger picture. And the additional thing is more and more over time, as we're getting, as you said right at the beginning, things are changing quickly, rapid market changes, new kind of focuses on what's important, what's not important, and needing to take into account all of those things as you're looking at really what's the impact that the procurement team is having in this space.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, if as a company you strategically set your goals to, limit cost exposure and to reduce emissions and to reduce consumption and to do this, that should be the baseline, right? Much more so than did we spend less this year than last year? Because in a lot of cases, because it's a commodity, that's really out of your control. Even in other cases, right? When you look at operational, right? We added a line of production, so of course our energy costs went up. But is that procurement's fault? Of course not, right?
Right.
You'd argue that's a good thing that we're spending more on electricity in that case, because that means we're selling more product. So look at the net whole, right, as opposed to just that one final number. Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap up with one last question, and that's going again all the way back to the beginning. We talked about so much change, and that's the same across a lot of different categories. Lots of change and uncertainty. Is the one thing, like when you look forward the next 3, 4, 5 months, one thing, if you had to choose one thing that an organization should be doing, a procurement team should be doing around energy, or making sure that they've got to focus on, so they're not missing, some of what's the next change, the next, event that could happen, what would you recommend them to do to keep their eyes on at least one thing over the next few months?
I'd say keep an eye on sustainability regulations, especially, and I think to boil it down to one, the SEC has posed pending regulations around the disclosure of scope 1 and 2 emissions. So anything that you're generating on site, any emissions generated on site, that's been in the works for a little over a year now. And that's going to be probably the single biggest piece of regulation that is going to impact the category the most, right? And it's not necessarily that they're going to mandate that, you need to reduce emissions, but just the need to gather that information and disclose it from a regulatory perspective. Now it's a financial grade data as opposed to the data that you just need to purchase about as much as you might need. Right. When it becomes financial grade, then it's a bigger ask, right? It's a bigger, category. It's a little bit more important that we make sure that we've got all that together. So I would say put a lot of focus on data quality, right, over the next few months to ensure that you're in a good position to kind of meet those regulations head on.
Well, that's great advice, Andrew, and I'm going to leave it there. It sounds like, well, one, it's great to hear that procurement can have an impact in the energy and utilities category because of that kind of myth at the beginning that I grew up with as well, that, well, that's one of those categories that we can't address. Obviously, we can address it. Not only can we address it, it's becoming more and more important because of all these external factors and regulatory requirements as well that really weren't present before. So really want to thank you so much, Andrew, for taking us through energy and utilities here in 2023 as we prepare for 24.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, fellas. It was great to be here.
And I want to wrap up as well because this was the last session of Category Palooza 2023. So I want to thank the team at Fine-Tune, Cost-Centric, Procurement IQ, Procure Analytics for all their support in putting together this event. We really thank them because, like I say, these events wouldn't be possible without them. And of course, everybody who joined us through each one of those sessions, bore with us during those tech gremlins at the beginning of the last session, and just for your continued support of Art of Procurement. So with that being said, well, it's time to put Category Palooza 2023 in the books. We have Mastermind Live coming up as our next event, which is on, let's see, I think it's November the 6th or 7th. It's you can go to artofprocurement.com/calendar to find out all the more details about that. So with that said, again, Andrew, thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you again next time.